There are moments in life that feel like they belong to someone else's story. The kind of moments you hear about but never think will happen to you. For me, that moment began innocently enough, with a family dinner and my son's endless chatter about his best friend Liam. It was the kind of evening you file away as unremarkable, a snapshot of normal life, before everything started to unravel. I'm Gary, 35, a college professor. My wife, Stacy, is 30, a lawyer with a knack for winning cases and an even sharper knack for winning arguments at home. We've been married for 9 years, with our son Matthew completing the picture of what I thought was a solid, happy family. Matthew is 7, bright, and energetic, the kind of kid who can talk your ear off about superheroes and dinosaurs without taking a breath. His best friend, Liam, is practically a fixture in our house these days, always running in and out like he's part of the family. Liam's dad, Brian, is someone I describe as a casual acquaintance. We'd spoken at school drop-offs, birthday parties, and the occasional weekend playdate, but I wouldn't say we were friends. He was just another dad in the background of our lives, friendly enough, but not someone I gave much thought to. That is, until recently. It started with the small things. Stacy began working later than usual, her already long hours at the firm stretching even further into the evenings. She said it was because of a high-profile case she'd been assigned, and I didn't question it. Stacy had always been ambitious, and I knew her career demanded a lot of her. But the late nights became more frequent, and so did her vague excuses. "It's just work," she'd say, brushing off my concerns with a quick smile. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Stacy had been quieter lately, more distracted, but I assumed it was because of the pressure she was under. She'd always had a habit of retreating into herself when things got tough, and I didn't want to push her. But then there were the other signs, the ones I couldn't ignore. Stacy had always been meticulous about her appearance, but lately she'd been putting in extra effort, even on days when she wasn't going to court. New clothes, a fresh haircut, and a bottle of perfume I didn't recognize suddenly appeared in our bathroom. When I asked about it, she said it was just to boost her confidence, something to help her feel more put together during a busy time. It sounded reasonable, so I let it go. Then there was her phone. Stacy had never been secretive about her phone before. It would sit on the counter or the coffee table, unlocked and forgotten. But now it was always with her, face down or tucked into her bag. She'd glance at it quickly when it buzzed, smiling faintly before slipping it back out of sight. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snooped or questioned her every move, so I ignored it. But the unease in my chest grew stronger every time I saw that faint smile. One night, as I was helping Matthew with his homework, he mentioned something that stuck with me. He said Liam's dad had been spending a lot of time at the park lately, sometimes even showing up when Liam wasn't there. It seemed like a throwaway comment, the kind of thing only a 7-year-old would find noteworthy. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Why would Brian be at the park without Liam? And why did Matthew seem to think it was worth mentioning? I brushed it off at the time, but over the next few days, I started noticing more connections between Stacy and Brian. She mentioned him in passing, saying he'd offered to pick up the boys from soccer practice or that he'd brought coffee to one of the games. Her tone was always casual, almost dismissive, as if she didn't want me to think too much about it. But the frequency of his name in our conversations began to bother me. The final straw came when I found a receipt in Stacy's car while I was cleaning it out. It was from a coffee shop across town, dated a day when she'd told me she was working late. The receipt had 2 drinks on it and a note scribbled at the bottom that read, "Thanks for the great chat, B." My stomach dropped as I stared at the receipt. It could have been innocent. Maybe it was just a work meeting, or maybe Brian had happened to be at the coffee shop and offered to keep her company. But combined with everything else, the late nights, the secrecy, the phone, the mentions of Brian, it felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I started paying closer attention, piecing together the little details I'd been ignoring. The way her voice softened when she talked about Brian. The way she avoided eye contact when I asked how her day was. The way her smile seemed forced when I mentioned spending more time together as a family. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were all there. Something was happening, and it was only a matter of time before I found out what it was. The receipt from the coffee shop lingered in my mind like a bad memory. It wasn't just a scrap of paper. It was a symbol of the unease that had been growing between Stacy and me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was harmless, that I was overreacting. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. Why was Brian, someone who was barely a friend, leaving notes for my wife? And why hadn't she mentioned seeing him outside of the usual soccer practices and playdates? The following week, Stacy's late nights continued. She said the case she was working on had reached a critical stage and that the hours would be brutal for a while. I nodded and pretended to believe her, but inside, I was starting to question everything. If she was spending all those nights at the office, why had I found that receipt? And why did she always seem so energized when she got home, as though she'd been doing something that made her feel alive? Matthew's innocent comments only added fuel to the fire. He casually mentioned that Liam's dad had been helping out more lately, bringing snacks to the soccer games, staying behind after practice to chat with the parents. He even said Brian had picked him and Liam up from school once when Stacy was too busy with work. The way Matthew said it, so matter-of-fact, made it sound completely normal. But to me, it was anything but. I started noticing how often Stacy and Brian's paths seemed to cross. At the park, at school events, even during the occasional birthday party. Their interactions were always polite, always friendly, but there was a familiarity between them that I couldn't ignore. It was in the way they smiled at each other, the way Stacy's laughter seemed just a little too warm when he was around. One night, while Stacy was working late again, I decided to check her calendar. She kept a meticulous schedule, color-coded appointments, court dates, client meetings, everything laid out in detail. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but when I saw an entry labeled Coffee with B, my stomach dropped. The date matched the receipt I'd found. It could have been innocent. Maybe Brian was helping her with something related to the kids. But why would she need to keep it a secret? And why hadn't she mentioned it, even in passing? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't want to put together. The turning point came during Matthew's soccer game that weekend. Stacy had insisted she couldn't make it, saying she had to prepare for an important meeting on Monday. I told her I'd take Matthew and stay for the whole game, figuring it would be a nice break from the tension that had been building at home. But as I stood on the sidelines, watching the kids run back and forth, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Brian was there, as usual, standing near the bleachers with a coffee in hand. He wasn't paying much attention to the game, though. Instead, he was looking at his phone, smiling faintly. A moment later, his phone buzzed, and he glanced up right at me. His expression shifted, and he quickly looked away, as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that his smile and Stacy's absence were connected. I tried to focus on the game, on cheering for Matthew, but my mind kept drifting back to Brian and his phone. What was he smiling at? Who was he texting? And why did it feel like he was hiding something? When I got home that evening, Stacy was in the kitchen, her laptop open and her phone buzzing beside her. She smiled when she saw me, asking how the game went. Her voice was cheerful, but her eyes darted to her phone, her fingers twitching slightly as if she were resisting the urge to check it. I gave her a brief summary of the game, watching her closely, but she didn't seem particularly interested. Later that night, after Stacy had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at my own phone. I thought about everything. The receipt, the calendar entry, the way Brian and Stacy seemed to orbit around each other in ways I couldn't explain. I knew I needed to know the truth, but I wasn't sure how to get it without tipping them off. I decided to keep watching, to gather more evidence before making any accusations. If there was something going on, I needed proof, something undeniable. But the weight of what I might find felt like a stone in my chest. Stacy wasn't just my wife. She was the mother of my child, my partner, the person I thought I could trust above all else. And Brian wasn't just another man. He was Liam's dad, someone who had become a part of our lives through our kids. The thought of betrayal from both of them was almost too much to bear. But I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The late nights, the guarded phone, the lingering looks, it all pointed to something I couldn't ignore. The unraveling of a lie often comes from the most unexpected places. For me, it came from Matthew, my bright, talkative 7-year-old, whose innocence made his words land with an impact I wasn't prepared for. It started as a normal evening. We were sitting on the couch, flipping through channels while he chattered about school, soccer, and the endless adventures he shared with his best friend Liam. I wasn't paying full attention, nodding along as he rattled off stories about dinosaurs and superheroes. But then he said something that made my heart stop. "Liam and I are like brothers now," he said with a grin, his eyes lighting up. He even stayed over one time with his dad. It was so much fun. I froze. The remote slipped from my hand as I turned to face him, the weight of his words sinking in. "When was that?" I asked, my voice calm, but my chest tightening. Matthew didn't seem to notice my sudden tension. He shrugged, still focused on his story. "It was when you were on your trip. Mommy said it was okay. Liam and I played games all night, and his dad slept in the guest room." I tried to process what he was saying, but my mind was racing. I remember the business trip he was referring to. It had been about a month ago, a quick 2-day conference for work. Stacy had encouraged me to go, saying she'd handle everything at home. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, trusting her completely. But now, hearing that Brian and Liam had stayed at our house while I was away, my stomach churned. Matthew's innocent excitement only made it worse. He talked about how they'd eaten pizza, stayed up late playing video games, and how Stacy had laughed at how much fun they were having. He even mentioned how Brian had helped tuck them in, reading them a story before bed. To Matthew, it was a fun sleepover, a memory he'd treasure. But to me, it felt like a betrayal I couldn't ignore. Why hadn't Stacy mentioned it? If it had been innocent, if she'd simply invited Liam and Brian over to keep Matthew company, why keep it from me? Why let me hear about it from our son, weeks after it had happened? I didn't let Matthew see how much his words rattled me. I smiled and nodded, asking him a few more questions to piece together the timeline. He happily obliged, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. He said it had been the first night of my trip, and that they'd stayed over until the next morning. "It was the best night ever," he added, his grin widening. When Matthew went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, replaying the conversation in my head. The puzzle pieces I'd been collecting were starting to fall into place, and the picture they formed wasn't one I wanted to see. The late nights, the coffee receipt, the calendar entry labeled coffee with B, and now this Brian staying at our house while I was out of town. It all felt too deliberate, too calculated to be a coincidence. I thought about Stacy's behavior since the trip. She'd been quieter, more distracted, her phone always close by, and her excuses for working late growing thinner. I'd chalked it up to stress, to the demands of her job, but now I wasn't so sure. The way she'd avoided eye contact when I asked about her day, the way she brushed off my questions about her schedule, it all pointed to something she didn't want me to know. And then there was Brian. His presence at the soccer games, his name popping up in Matthew's stories, the way he and Stacy seemed to orbit around each other in ways I couldn't explain. I thought about the way he'd smiled at his phone during that game, the way he quickly looked away when he saw me watching. Was that the same night he'd stayed at my house? Had he been texting Stacy while I was standing just a few feet away? I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. I wanted to confront Stacy, to demand answers, but I knew I couldn't do it without proof. If I accused her now, she'd have plenty of room to deny it, to twist the story and make me feel like I was overreacting. I needed to be sure, to have something concrete before I could bring this to light. I thought about the guest room, the place Matthew said Brian had stayed. I couldn't shake the image of him sitting there, comfortable in my home, laughing with my wife while I was miles away. It felt like a violation, like the life I thought I'd built was slipping through my fingers. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Stacy and Brian together, their shared moments playing out in my mind like a cruel montage. The trust I'd placed in her, the love I'd felt for her, it all felt tainted now, shadowed by doubt and suspicion. But I knew I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. If there was something going on, I needed to know for sure. I needed to gather more pieces of the puzzle, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. After hearing Matthew's innocent story about the sleepover with Liam and Brian, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening right under my nose. I needed clarity, and I needed it fast. Sitting back and waiting for the truth to reveal itself wasn't an option anymore. If Stacy and Brian were betraying me, I had to catch them in the act. That weekend, Stacy told me she'd be spending Saturday afternoon at the office preparing for a big case. She'd been using this excuse more frequently, and by now, it had lost any credibility. I told her I'd take Matthew to the park with Liam, figuring it would be the perfect cover to investigate her workday. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and left with a casual wave. As I watched her car disappear down the street, I felt a surge of determination. This was it, the moment I'd finally uncover the truth. After dropping Matthew and Liam off at the park with another parent, I drove toward Stacy's office. Her car wasn't in the parking lot. My stomach tightened as I checked the nearby streets and still found no sign of her. I decided to take a chance and drive toward Brian's neighborhood. It felt desperate, like a long shot, but my instincts told me it was worth the risk. As I turned onto Brian's street, my heart sank. Stacy's car was parked 2 houses down from his, tucked neatly against the curb as if it belonged there. I pulled over a few houses away and parked, my mind racing. My pulse pounded in my ears as I sat there, staring at her car, willing myself to stay calm. This was the proof I'd been looking for, but I needed more. I needed something undeniable. I waited for what felt like an eternity, watching the house through my rearview mirror. Eventually, the front door opened, and there she was, Stacy, stepping out with Brian right behind her. They were laughing, their faces lit with an ease and familiarity that felt like a punch to the gut. As I watched, Brian reached out and touched her arm, his hand lingering there for just a moment too long. I grabbed my phone and started recording. The video captured everything. Their laughter, the way they leaned into each other, the way Stacy glanced around nervously before stepping closer to him. And then it happened. Brian leaned in, and she didn't pull away. Their kiss wasn't brief or hesitant. It was deliberate, intimate, and completely shattering. I kept filming, my hands trembling as I tried to steady the camera. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to confront them, to demand answers, to unleash the anger and heartbreak that was threatening to consume me. But I held back. This wasn't the time for emotions. This was the time for evidence. After a few minutes, Stacy and Brian walked back inside, leaving me alone in my car, grappling with the weight of what I'd just witnessed. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I fought to control my breathing. The betrayal was undeniable now, but there was still more to do. I needed to make sure this evidence was secure, that it couldn't be dismissed or denied. I backed my car up slightly, angling it toward the house for a better view. I took photos of Stacy's car parked outside, zooming in to capture the license plate and the location. I even filmed a few additional minutes of the house, noting the time and date on my phone as I recorded. Every piece of evidence mattered, and I wasn't leaving anything to chance. Satisfied that I had enough, I drove away, my mind a whirlwind of anger, pain, and determination. I sent everything to my lawyer, photos, videos, timestamps, with a brief explanation of what I'd discovered. The response came quickly. This was solid evidence, more than enough to support my case if I decided to file for divorce. Knowing I had that safety net gave me a small sense of relief, though it did little to ease the ache in my chest. When I picked up Matthew and Liam from the park later that afternoon, I forced a smile, trying to hide the storm raging inside me. Matthew was full of stories about their games and adventures, his laughter filling the car as we drove home. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that his world was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly understand. Stacy arrived home later that evening, her hair slightly tousled, her expression calm and casual as she greeted me. She didn't know I'd seen everything, that her carefully constructed lies were unraveling faster than she could keep up with. I played along, pretending nothing was wrong, even as the weight of her betrayal threatened to crush me. But now, I had the truth, and soon so would she. The day I told Stacy I was filing for divorce was the day her carefully constructed world began to crumble. I've been waiting for the right moment, the moment when I had all the evidence I needed and the strength to say the words without breaking. That moment came one quiet evening, after Matthew was asleep and the house was shrouded in the kind of stillness that makes every word feel louder. Stacy was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware of what was coming. I placed the envelope containing the divorce papers on the table in front of her, the weight of everything I'd been holding in suddenly released. Her initial reaction was confusion, a furrowed brow, and a nervous laugh, as if she thought it was some kind of cruel joke. But when she opened the envelope and saw the papers inside, her expression changed. Panic flickered across her face, followed by disbelief. She stammered, trying to find the right words, her usual composure unraveling before my eyes. She asked why, her voice trembling, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind, searching for an explanation, a way to regain control of the situation. That's when I told her everything. The late nights, the coffee receipt, the night she and Brian kissed outside his house. It all came spilling out, each word landing like a blow. Stacy's face went pale as she realized the depth of what I knew. She tried to deny it at first, to twist the truth, to make it seem like I was overreacting or misunderstanding. But when I showed her the videos, the photos, the evidence that left no room for doubt, her excuses crumbled. She sat there, silent and stunned, the reality of her actions finally catching up with her. The divorce was messy, as I expected it would be. Stacy wasn't just losing me. She was losing everything she'd built her identity around. Her job, her friends, even her relationship with Matthew. I made sure of it. I wasn't looking for revenge, but I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. Through my lawyer, I provided her firm with the evidence of her affair. It wasn't out of spite. It was a necessary move to protect my own reputation, to ensure that her lies didn't spill over into my professional life. The fallout was swift. Her firm let her go within days, citing a violation of their code of ethics. Stacy had built her career on integrity, and now, that very foundation had been ripped away. Her friends were the next to go. Many of them were mutual acquaintances, parents from Matthew's school or the soccer field. When the truth of her affair with Brian came out, the whispers started. The invitations stopped. Even the ones who tried to stay neutral couldn't ignore the weight of what she'd done, especially when it became clear how it had affected Matthew. But the hardest blow for Stacy was losing Matthew. During the custody proceedings, my lawyer presented the evidence of her affair, her neglect, and the way she'd brought chaos into our family. The court ruled in my favor, granting me full custody. Stacy was given limited visitation, supervised at first, until she could demonstrate stability. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. I knew I was the better parent, the one Matthew needed to guide him through the fallout of this mess. In the weeks following the divorce, Stacy tried to reach out, to apologize, to explain. But I wasn't interested in her words. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. I focused on Matthew, on rebuilding our lives, on creating a home filled with honesty and trust. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Stacy's choices cost her everything she once held dear, but they don't define me or Matthew. We're stronger than that. We're building a new life, one rooted in honesty, respect, and love. To anyone reading this, you are stronger than you think. Trust yourself, protect what matters, and never settle for less than you deserve. Better days are ahead.